This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for How to Super Age with Elise Marie Collins. And Elise, every podcast, you bring us one more individual that just enlightens us and makes us realize that aging is actually a beautiful thing. So thank you. So who do you have today?
My guest today, I've known her for several years. I've really kind of lost track. The first time I met her was through an organization that we both belong to. I think you've heard of it, but I'll mention it for our listeners. It's called Women's National Book Association, and it's a national organization, and we have a local chapter. And I happen to be the president of our local San Francisco Bay Area based chapter. So I met Diane at a wine, women, words, I don't know what we call it, but we met at a local wine bar, all kinds of members. And members of this group, they're not only writers, but they're also librarians, anyone who is connected with selling books and promoting books and all the things that we need to do as books. And Diane's just a stellar member and a stellar person in the community. I'm going to read her bio. So, and I also got to hang out with her. It'll be like a week from last weekend. And that was fabulous at the San Francisco Writers Conference where we had a table. So I'm going to read from her bio. And I'm going to say, usually I have guests give a little shorter bio, but I read her bio and there's not much to cut out because she's led a long life in a good way. I think she's been packing it in every year, every decade. So here's her bio. Diane LeBeau's recent book, Dancing on the Wine Dark Sea, memoir of a trailblazing woman's travels, adventures, and romance. Yeah. It was a finalist for the 2022 International Book Awards, and it's available all over. We're going to share some links in the show notes. Diane's also an award-winning writer and photojournalist. So she not only writes about what she sees all over the world, she takes the photos. She gets those images. And she's a recipient of numerous awards, among them the Gold and Silver Solas Awards for Best Women's Travel Writing. She's also the president emerita of Bay Area Women Travel Writers, or Bay Area Travel Writers. She's based in San Francisco, and she's got numerous published stories all over. She's so widely published. I'm just going to mention she's on salon.com, and you can check her website for many of her other links and places where you can find her writing. She's traveled to over 90 countries. She spent time with Afghan women, the Hopi, Amazon people, Tuvans, love those Tuvans. They can do that throat singing. Mongolians, Corsicans, and Parisians, among others. And she's scuba dived with sharks. Ooh, got to hear about that. In the Red Sea. And she's trained champion Morgan horses, which I don't even know what that is, but fascinating. She's also, not only this, she's an academic. She's like hardcore. She's got the chops. She pioneered women's studies programs. In fact, she might have been the one that, she'll have to tell us about this, but I definitely took women's studies in college, and it was a thing. But before her, there wasn't women's studies. She received her Ph.D. in the history of consciousness from the University of California. Okay. I'm about to explode. She's not only an academic, she's got like the spiritual. Okay. She's also a recipient of the Lifetime Achievement Award from Douglas College at Rutgers University. Diane began her teaching career in the Netherlands, and she was a college professor in Paris, New York City, and California. So she not only traveled, she lived in these places, and she is a woman of the world. So Diane, it is such a pleasure to have you. Tell us a little bit about maybe why you wrote the book. I know you're going to read a little bit from the book, but before we just dive into reading, because we don't normally have authors read, but I think in this case, we're making a lot of exceptions. Long bio, there's just so much to cover. And I just want to hear about what what made you decide to write this memoir, and maybe some of the feedback you've gotten from people that have read it. How has it helped them? Because we're here to learn how to super age, and it seems like you're our role model.
Well, thanks. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you to everybody involved in this. Well, I've gotten older, and it's still a surprise. I keep looking behind me. Can this be me? I mean, I'm over 80 now. Oh my God. And there is creakiness involved, but still there's so many memories. It's amazing. There's a quote that I love from Zora Neale Hurston, Their Eyes Were Watching God, where her character Janie, who's had a really tough life as a poor Black woman, finally she comes home to her original home in the South, and she sits on her porch, and it says, I don't have the quote in front of me, but Janie pulled in her fishing net, so much of life in its web. And that's what I've been feeling like, wow, I've had all these experiences, and they seem like just yesterday. They don't seem like 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. How I wrote the book, I actually wrote it in pieces because besides teaching college, I always was a writer from the time I was about 4. I pretended, even I didn't know how to write, I pretended I was writing a book. I had blank books, and I loved being read to and then reading when I could learn to read. So I started writing my stories. I was traveling. I got to move to Europe in my 20s. As you mentioned, I lived in Holland for 4 years. And the stories just kind of came out of me. And then people said, wow, you should make them available. So I started publishing them individually. So a lot of the stories in my book, unlike a lot of memoirs that are written totally looking back, my stories were written as I lived them, a lot of the stories. And I filled in with others, more memory stories later on. So that's kind of it. And I love, like I suppose any teacher or writer, being the center of attention. So I love being here. And it's wonderful to have a story out and get feedback, and people say, oh, that really talked to me. Like being a teacher, when my students come back after 10, 20 years and say, your course changed my life.
Yeah, and that reminded me of a question I wanted to ask you. You mentioned that you taught Hell's Angels and that something happened. Tell me that story, because I heard a little bit of it, but I'd love for listeners to hear it. And I think I didn't get the full story.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, the idea of having women in the curriculum was anathema when, I'm talking about late 70s, when we started. Some of us met in the Bay Area and we talked about creating a feminist college. And that idea actually turned into the National Women's Studies Association. But, I looked at I first had a master's from Berkeley in English. And then I realized I knew very little about women writers. I knew Jane Austen and Emily Dickinson. So after teaching for 15 years, I decided to go back for my doctorate. In the only program that would allow, there was no such thing called women's studies, but history of consciousness is not exactly airy-fairy like it sounds. It's really the history of intellectual consciousness. So I looked back at, like, how did women get in this position? Have we always been subservient or subordinate? And what caused this? And how can we stop it? So that the HISCON at Santa Cruz let me do a history of feminist consciousness and history of women through anthropology, archaeology, history, historical documents. So that's how I did that. Anyway, so I got women's studies started at Kenyatta College, which is one of the California community colleges just south of San Francisco. And much to the chagrin of the male administrators, who said, well, what about male studies? I said, well, that's the rest of the curriculum. So I had these intro to women's studies classes and women writers classes, and people just would come in out of curiosity. And 2 guys were Hell's Angels, and they were really sweethearts. I didn't know much about Hell's Angels. They didn't know much about feminism. And they were really top students. 20 years went by, and they popped up on campus, both of them, with their now wives, to introduce their wives to me and talk about how my intro to women's studies class changed their lives.
Wow.
It's very touching.
That is amazing. Wonderful.
Yeah, that it makes me almost tear up. It's something, yeah, I really appreciate that story. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I wonder, I know that you grew up in kind of a 50s different paradigm for women, and I know my mom experienced that too. And we may hear a little bit about this in the intro, but can you tell us, because people forget, I think, if you're, especially those of you listening, if you're younger, we forget, like, there was no women's studies, the things that we take for granted. Women didn't have careers, unless they had to, that's how it was when I was growing up. But my mom had a career because she chose to. So just like, was it just something you felt inside you your entire life, or did you go into the paradigm and go out? Or tell us a little bit about how you wrestled with that. We'll call it the paradigm of.
Right. Yeah. Should I read from my intro? Because I addressed that in the intro.
Yeah. And then maybe, if there's anything you go,
Okay,
for it. I know the intro. I read it.
It's called why I didn't stay home. From my earliest memories, I was a rebel with a cause. What was my cause? I didn't exactly know yet, but growing up in the 50s, I chafed at the restricted roles available to women and girls. Quote, "One day you'll be a wife and mother and a helpmate to your husband," was a common refrain. While studying pre-veterinary medicine at Penn State in 1957, I was the only woman in a class of 500. My advisor, a male veterinarian, called me into his office and said, "We don't want you here. You're just going to get married, You're wasting our time. You're taking the space away from a man." Such experiences were common in those years. And I was what was called a tomboy back then. I was athletic. I found my closest buddies with animals, with stray cats, with snakes. I grew up in an urban town right near Manhattan, but I longed to be a cowboy. And then I found out I couldn't be a cowboy. And cowgirls seemed to have kind of wussy roles, like looking adoringly up at Roy Rogers or the Lone Ranger or whatever. And I didn't want to do that. So my parents were not wealthy, but they recognized how much I wanted to learn to ride. So my mom, who was a teacher, paid for my horseback riding lessons. And I just got really close to animals and outdoorsy stuff, forests, and found, I guess, independence through, I think physicality is really important for women to know. And I'm so proud of the young women these days and the older women who are athletic and strong, because we were not in those days. I was athletic, but I remember like boys saying to me, "Just be a girl, let me help you walk." And we wore ridiculous clothing, high heels and tight skirts, and it was really hard to move around. Crinolines. So I think being physically strong is really important. And talking about aging, that's one thing that I am working on. And it takes a lot of doing as you see your body parts slough off. Like I'm sitting here with a new knee from 5 weeks ago, and I've just been replacing joints as they wear out. And thank goodness we can do that these days.
Exactly.
So I say being physically strong and not accepting when people say you can't do things.
Yeah. And have you found that as you've grown older, or is it just so ingrained in you that you just do the things that you want to do? Yeah.
I think I've always been, I guess what's called a contrarian. In Jersey, I'm from Jersey. Jersey language, we'd say, "Yeah, but," when people say this is the way it is, or this is what you should do, and I'd say, "Yeah, but." So I was known for that expression.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I know that you hung out with women all over the world. Was there something, because sometimes, in different cultures, women are still treated as subordinate or subservient. Is there, I know you may read a little bit about, I'm particularly interested in women in Afghanistan, especially because that's so important today. But could you just talk a little bit about how you interacted with women around the world and what that taught you?
Yeah, I mean, traveling as a single woman, which is what I did most of my life, women have much more access and insights into women's culture. Like one of my first academic pieces was about the Hopi, the Pueblo women, Pueblo people in Arizona. And I think there were 12 major anthropologists who had worked on the Hopi over the years, and 10 of them were male, and they talked about all the male rituals. And it turns out that the Hopi are actually matrilineal. Lineage goes from the mother to the daughter line. So women are really important. They own everything, and they divide the corn crop and so on and so forth. But the male anthropologists didn't have access to them. So I went to Hopi land and by myself, and I just sat on a rock near the mesas. They live up on these stone mesas. There are people that have never been colonized or conquered. And eventually people started talking to me and invited me into their pueblos and into the schools. So women exist in these cultures, and the same with Afghan women. I got involved in a group when I was teaching and living in Paris. This was 2000, when the Taliban were in power. And a lot of women had exiled, and Afghans, men as well as women. But there was a group of women living in exile in Paris, and my French friends knew them, and we all decided to try to help them. And what could they do? They were trying to get rid of the Taliban. They were trying to rewrite their constitution. And so we helped set up a conference it was going to be in Afghanistan, but our longer story, but our helicopter was shot down, so we never made it to Afghanistan. But we got to Tajikistan, which is one of the stands just right close to Afghanistan, and met for a whole week with about 500 women. And one of those stories is in the book, and helped them write a declaration of the essential rights of Afghan women that did get written into their constitution the following year, and was signed by Kofi Annan and Bill Clinton, who was president at the time. So, I got to know them, and a lot of them were, a lot of people think Afghan women are all subservient and uneducated, but these were doctors, lawyers, writers, different pharmacists, and very educated women, and very strong women. So, and I met women who, like school principals, who had continued to have secret schools in their basements, in their houses, or in the back, shed for girls. And I met some of those girls who were so yearning to be educated. And I remember they held on to my hands when I had to leave. They say, please, please stay and teach us. There's such longing for education that our kids often take too much for granted and don't care about. So as a woman traveler, you really can get to meet women, and that male travelers, or if you're with a male companion, it's sometimes harder to do.
Absolutely.
So in these countries, such as Afghanistan, you said was easier as a woman to connect. Is there a fear of the male population?
When I was there, I mean, now it's terrible. I don't even know what to say. It's terrible. And I don't know that anybody knows the answer. But I met numbers and befriended numbers of Afghan men. I write about it. and there's some of them are sweethearts. I never really met a nasty one, to tell you the truth. They have a great respect for educated people, especially educated women. And I don't necessarily say I'm a professor, I say I'm a teacher, and that resonates with people. Sure. And they're very kind. They're, you know, they were fun. My book ends with a story with one of my buddies. I went back a couple of times over the years and helped his family rebuild their pueblo, their house. I mean, their mud brick house, not really a pueblo. And they're dear friends. His wife is shy, but she's there, and she looks at him with great love, and was happy to have me there.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's amazing. Are there any other cultures like the Hopi that you encountered that are quote unquote matrilineal? How do you say it?
Matrilineal.
Matrilineal, yes.
Matrilineal.
Because
not necessarily. I mean, yeah, I think a lot of indigenous cultures are actually matrilineal, because the truth is that until probably it was the time of Aeschylus, about, I don't know, 6,000 years before Christ or more, that a light bulb went on and they saw the connection between intercourse and procreation, because they knew, everybody knows where babies come from, but they never really could prove that men were involved in this. So when men figured it out, and it's in a Greek play by Aeschylus, the Greek playwright, where they not only discovered, quote unquote, that men were the fathers of these children, but that they wanted to claim they were the only parent. And the way to control that was to control the women, because so they started, you know, before then, women were pretty free to do what they wanted to do, or at least sexually. But once, I think it really probably started with the Greeks and the Romans, that they started locking their women up, because the only way you could know who your children were is to make sure no other man tampered with her.
Interesting.
And it was interesting in ancient Greek times, Athenian times, that the women who were not married were called hetara, and like one hetara, who were kind of prostitutes, but not necessarily with a negative connotation, but they were free. So one of them, Aspasia, was actually the mathematics tutor of Aristotle, and women like her were able to go to gatherings with people like Socrates and learn and read books, whereas the wealthy married women were living pretty boring lives at home, doing one of the, I'm always interested in kinky stuff, removing body hair with candles.
Oh God.
Oh, that hurts.
That hurts, right? So that's how they would entertain themselves at home alone during the day, among other things.
Wow. Yeah.
But I did find, well, in one of my stories, I talk about meeting women in Morocco. And I was traveling in, I think it was Essaouira, and I had a guide and driver. I try to hire local people to show me around and drive, especially if I'm by myself. It's really great to have a driver. Makes it easier. But I said, well, where can I meet the women of the town? And he said, go to the wall at sunset. So I went to the wall of the town. It's a wall town. And the men were all sitting together and looking kind of bored and glum. And then I went a little further and I saw all the women, and they were giggling and laughing and singing. And I thought, well, I don't want to be too pushy. So I kind of stayed in the background, and they started saying, come up, come up, come up. And I speak French, and some of them spoke French. And they told me funny stories, like one of the jolliest. I said, well, are you guys married? And she said, yeah, I'm married, but my husband works in France. He's only home 1 week a year.
Oh.
So I said, maybe the trick to a happy marriage is not being together all the time.
I guess. Wow.
That's hilarious. That's wonderful. And then did you end up befriending the women or hanging out with them beyond the wall?
No, actually, I didn't at in that particular time, but there have been other times when I have.
And tell us about in your book, is it stories of different places that you've traveled and stories with interacting? I've only read the very beginning and I'm looking forward to reading more.
Yeah, well, I cover a lot of different countries through some age periods. For example, going to Morocco, going to Greece right after I was married in my 20s to a Dutch medical student. That's how one reason I ended up in Holland. And after my divorce, and actually I left him for a young horse trainer. I have to admit, I did training a horse. I've had a shady past. But when that was over, I was teaching Greek literature. So I went to Greece and met a lot of different women and different people there, and had an interesting adventure because I was steeped in Greek culture and some of the tales of ancient Greek women. And then years later, I went with my mom and had a trip around Greece. And then a few years after that, my mom had died, and I took her ashes to the island of Halki, where she and I had traveled and sprinkled. I was with a women's creativity group on this little island. And I wrote a poem that's in my book about my mom and what we inherit from the older women in our lives. And now I'm one. So I hope I'm giving things for people to inherit. But we sprinkled her ashes in the sea on this little island. And I don't know that I believe in magical things, but I was with about 6 or 7 women who were writers and musicians. And as we sprinkled the ashes, the whole sea bubbled up, like it was just caused goosebumps. And I have no explanation for why that happened, but it did.
Wow. Do you want to read anything from your book, like a little passage? You have something that you could share with us? Because these stories are so powerful and they touch us in such a different way. And I love the way your book and the way you tell stories. You've had adventures your whole life. You've been to me, you're an enlightened being because you've been true to yourself and not giving into what, the social norms, the social pressures. They're going to be different in every era. And when we study, as a student of gerontology, we talk about the life course, and that's you're grounded and rooted in a time in history. And so we can either kind of be victims to that. Sometimes we're caught up in it for different things, but I just love the way you have so much agency.
Right. I'm trying to pick one.
Okay.
Let's see, what would be a good one?
I'll just say, yeah, I love that you are still teaching and writing. And I know you had a super successful book launch, which many people would love to have 70 people at their book launch of any age, but that you are rocking the book launch. That is.
Yeah, no, that was really great.
Yeah. At a prestigious bookstore, Book Passage. They've had
I'll read from the beginning of one of the Afghan stories. How about that?
That would be great. Yeah.
This is called Dinner in Dushanbe, Tajikistan. Please speak out about these crimes, but tell not just about the suffering, but also about the successes, how we are resisting, said Halida, a math professor from Kabul who ran secret schools for girls inside Afghanistan throughout the repressive Taliban regime. Dressed in a gunmetal gray long dress, her resolute features contrasted with her delicately embroidered white headscarf. She was one of several hundred Afghan women with whom I spent a week in Tajikistan, not far from the Afghan border. Getting to know them and hearing their stories taught me a lot about our shared humanity and the human ability not only to survive, but to continue to savor life. It was June 2000. The Taliban were still in power in Afghanistan. Their treatment of women seemed to me the ultimate in man's inhumanity to women, imprisoned in their houses, denied education, or even or the ability to work, forced marriages, beaten, and even stoned to death. And I wanted to do something to help. And then I talked about how I happened to get there. And let's see.
Well, while you're looking, I'm just going to say your words are incredible. Your skill with words and your writing is a treat and a delight. And
thank you. That warms my heart, my writer's heart. Well, one thing that happened was I met while I was there. Well, I can read this part. One afternoon outside the meeting hall, the face of one woman especially intrigued me because you were asking about going home with them. And this is one situation where I did. As I looked out on that sweltering day, Sophia, in a black dress and coat, formed a slight figure. Probably in her 20s, her gaunt face and dark hair peeked out from under her black and tan headscarf. Her large eyes had a tragic, almost hypnotic stare. I introduced myself in simple French and English. As we talked a bit, Sophia explained her situation. My sister died 3 months ago. My husband is in southern Tajikistan trying to find work. I'm living here with my brother-in-law and taking care of his 3 children. Before we parted, she invited me to dinner that evening at her family's home. Not thinking about possible risks, the opportunity to spend time with the family and get away from the hotel where we were staying appealed to me. About 8 p.m., her brother-in-law, Mohammed, picked me up at my hotel. Dressed in tan slacks and a white shirt, he explained that his business, I'll skip this a little bit, making our way along the dimly lit, empty streets. As we neared each intersection, Mohammed flattened the gas pedal on the floor. We flew past the police who were stationed on each of the 4 corners of every block. They're out each evening and stop anyone they feel might give them a good bribe, he explained. A breakaway state from the former Soviet Union, Tajikistan's supposed democracy is at best corrupt and at worst very much a police state. And I'll just read one more paragraph. After about 10 minutes, we parked out beside a Soviet block cement apartment house. We walked up 3 flights of uneven and broken stairs in the pitch black. Sophia, who met us out front, held fast to my hand and guided me up 1 step at a time. No, there are no lights, they apologized. The sweat was running off me in the heat. It occurred to me that I hadn't told anyone from our group where I was going. We'd been warned not to wander around in town at night. People were living under desperate conditions here. Was I about to be kidnapped? I thought about turning and running back down the stairs, but where would I go? I had no idea how to get back to the hotel. So instead, the door opened to a brightly lit and spacious apartment, clean but sparsely furnished. An elderly woman hunched over with osteoporosis, but still spry and cheerful, whom they introduced as Appa, or grandmother, planted kisses on both my cheeks. So I had a nice dinner with them. And at the end of the evening, one of the young girls said, "Please adopt me," because they had learned that I didn't have family, I didn't have children. They said, "You must be lonely. Take me home with you." And I thought they were kidding, but they really meant it. And I thought, ooh, maybe could I do that? I had no idea how I would do it. But I've stayed in touch with that girl, and she's now in her 20s. She's gotten a couple of graduate degrees. And she's unfortunately she got out of Afghanistan before the recent Taliban takeover, but I don't know where she is. I haven't heard from her in a while.
Wow. Well, your stories are rich, and I think many of our listeners are going to want to grab a copy of your book. Can you hold it up? Thank you. And say the title again, just because it's a longer title.
Okay. And I'll explain the title too. Dancing on the Wine Dark Sea. And in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, Homer, the Greek writer, famous Greek writer, described the sea as wine dark, because it's believed the ancient Greeks didn't have a word for dark blue. So he called the sea wine dark. So the subtitle is Memoir of a Trailblazing Woman's Travels, Adventures, and Romance. And there are sexy bits in this that sometimes I'm a little embarrassed now that I look back at my adventures as a younger girl, but older girls can have fun too.
Absolutely.
And it's part of my thrust, as they say in the book. Well, that's a masculine term.
Yeah.
So yeah, the book is available through bookstores or online. Just ask your bookstore to order it.
You are an incredible woman, and you give women today that opportunity to say, if she did it, if Diane did it back in the day, I definitely can do it now. And, you know, age has nothing to do with our abilities. Our abilities come from within. So kudos to you, Diane, for everything you've been doing.
Thank you. And I'll say, you know, it's not always easy, especially facing old age. Like as I mentioned at the beginning, that I'm surprised that I'm old, you know, and everything. I used to run 10K runs, and I used to ski and scuba dive, and I still dance. I really like dancing. And as I say, I'm just replacing parts as necessary. And I think it's important to stay in touch with all generations. I mean, there's some wonderful senior facilities or groups in San Francisco that I belong to, but especially with my writer friends or younger friends, I like to stay in touch with them. There are a couple of places where I go dancing a couple of times a week, and
I love it.
I don't dance really, I don't flip upside down, but you can shake it around, and it's really much more fun than the stationary bicycle.
Absolutely.
There's some wisdom. Drop a bomb for us.
Yeah.
Well, this has been amazing. And I hope everyone can get your book, and we can find you. We'll put your website in the show notes as well. I think it's DianeLeBeau.com. Is that correct?
Correct, right. And there was a YouTube video. I don't understand YouTube, but for some reason they took down the launch video, which was really interesting. And it will be up probably by the end of the day. My a friend that helps me with marketing is going to make sure it gets back up. So
wonderful.
Send it over. We'll put it in the show notes, because I know you have
very much.
Great book launch, and you are a role model for us all. And not just that you're slaying it at your age, and that I don't like to say that because that's not what I mean. You're slaying it at any age. You are an incredible inspiration. So thank you so much for sharing.
You know, at the book conference last weekend, I went to a panel with teachers who work with inner city kids, and part of my heart is still in teaching and, you know, helping people grow, and they were talking how hard it is. They were using poetry to teach kids that live in really difficult situations. Like this one young man would start to write a poem, and then he'd go home and his father would beat him up. And these teachers were like a little downhearted about, were they achieving anything? And it almost brought me to tears, because I made a little tiny speech about students that have come back to me after 20 years, and you never know what, not just as a teacher, but as a human being, what seed you might spark or plant in somebody, and they might not react immediately, but they'll think about it. So I think we
Absolutely.
all are influences for each other, and I feel we're all in this big parade together, and should cheer each other on, especially women.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's you just summed up the podcast, How to Super Age, why we're here. She just said it. So,
Absolutely. Thank you both.
Thank you so much for including me. And buy my
Everyone,
book.
have a great day now. Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye. Thanks
you.
a lot.